everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Molly, and in today's video we're going to be talking about the case of Angela Samota. By the way, I post true crime videos like this every single week, so I would love it if you could subscribe to my channel if you enjoy this kind of content. But yeah, like I said, today we're going to be talking about the case of Angela Samota, and this case is a really unique one. I've never come across a case quite like this one before. Just the way in which this case was solved is really incredible, and I just had to share this story with you guys. Quickly before I do get into it, I just want to clarify that my intent with these videos is never to offend or upset anyone that may have been involved with the case. Everything that I've collected for this video has been from several different sources online, all of which are linked in the description as usual. And having said all of that, let's just get into today's case. So this case took place in Dallas in Texas in the US. Angela Samota, who was nicknamed Angie by her friends and family, was born on the 19th of September 1964. She was a 21-year-old girl, and she was originally from Alameda, which is a city in California. Now, I couldn't find much information online about Angela's childhood, so I'm guessing it was just pretty normal. However, I do know that she grew up without a father, I believe. I don't know what happened there with her father, but I just know that she grew up without one. She was a very beautiful girl. If you just look at pictures of her, she is really, really beautiful. She had the loveliest smile, which her friends said just lit up the whole room. She was described as being very lively and vivacious. She was helpful and friendly. She just had a great personality. She seemed like the type of person you would really want to be friends with. She was also very smart and academic, and at the time of this case taking place in October of 1984, she was actually enrolled at the Southern Methodist University in Texas, where she was studying computer science and electrical engineering. This was the career path that she wanted to pursue, and at the time it was a very male-dominated profession. In fact, she was one of the only few girls actually studying the subject. But Angela had a real passion for it, and she already had an engineering job lined up for when she finished university. Angela was part of a sorority in college, and her roommate was a girl named Sheila. Sheila and Angela met in 1982, so 2 years before this case happened. Sheila was studying psychology at university, and she was quite quiet and shy. She wasn't the type to, go to parties and get drunk, whereas Angela was pretty much the complete opposite. Like I mentioned earlier, she was very lively and she had a lot of friends, and she would enjoy going out and having a couple of drinks. And so when the two girls met in 1982, when Sheila and Angela met, they didn't really gel that much. They didn't really get along that well because they were so different. And also because at the time, Angela had a boyfriend whose name I couldn't actually find, but Sheila did not like this boy. Apparently he could be quite controlling of Angela, and so she just didn't like him, but eventually Angela broke up with this boy anyway. And it was after Angela broke up with her boyfriend that she and her roommate Sheila actually became pretty close. They started talking about school and their lives, and they realised that they actually had a pretty similar upbringing and family dynamic. You see, both Angela and Sheila didn't have fathers. Both of their dads were not active parts of their lives, and they kind of bonded over this. They understood each other, and they realised that they weren't so different after all. And they soon became like best friends, and Sheila described Angela as being a triple threat. She said that she had a great personality, she was cute, and she was smart. And the first few years at uni was just great for Angela. She seemed to be having a really great time. She was studying a good course, she had lovely friends, she was just happy, and she had a whole life in front of her. But then that would all change on October the 12th, 1984. That evening, it was a Friday night, and Angela and two of her friends, one of which was a male named Russell and the other was a female whose name I couldn't actually find, but her and her two friends went to the state fair in Texas. At the time, Angela had another boyfriend. However, he couldn't go to the state fair with her because he was actually a construction worker and he had to get up early the next morning for work. And the day following this, the University of Texas football team was due to be playing a game against the University of Oklahoma. And so Angela was really excited about this and she did plan on going to the game the next day. But anyway, like I said, on the evening of the 12th, Angela and her two friends went to the state fair in Texas, and then later on that evening they went to the Rio Room dance club where they were dancing, and I believe they may have been drinking alcohol, but I don't think Angela was drinking because she was the one driving, but nevertheless she was still having a really fun night with her friends. They stayed at the Rio Room dance club till around 1 a.m. and then when they left, Angela dropped her two friends back at their homes. After this, she quickly stopped by her boyfriend's apartment just to say goodnight, and then she left to go back to her apartment. Now, Angela would have been alone in her apartment that night because her roommate and best friend Sheila had actually gone home to northern Texas for the weekend to see her family, and so she wasn't there. So Angela was alone in her apartment, and at some point her boyfriend actually had a call from her not long after she had left his apartment. He said that he picked up this call but it quickly disconnected, and so he became really concerned because it was the middle of the night and I think he was worried that maybe she didn't get home safe and that something happened to her on her way home. I don't know if Angela actually said anything on the phone call before it disconnected. One source said that she said, "Talk to me," and then the phone went dead. But anyway, her boyfriend was really concerned and so he got in his car and decided to drive to her apartment just to see if she was okay. However, when he got there, the door was locked and she just wasn't answering. So her boyfriend went back to his car because I believe his mobile phone was in his car. He went back there and he decided to ring the police and just ask if they could come and check on Angela and break into her apartment because she just wasn't answering the door. So the police did. They were let into Angela's apartment by the apartment manager, and when they went inside they found Angela Samota's dead, naked body on her bed. Her legs were dangling over the side of the bed. She was absolutely covered in blood, and next to her on the bed was her stuffed rabbit cuddly toy. Although it was obvious that Angela was dead, her eyes were actually wide open, and the police officer who found her body says that he still to this day is haunted by her bright blue eyes. As you can imagine, the news about Angela's death spread really quickly and everyone was just horrified. The other students, her friends, her roommate Sheila, who, if you remember, was at home in northern Texas with her family at the time, received a phone call the morning following Angela's murder from one of Angie's sorority sisters, and they told her the news that Angela had been murdered. And Sheila was just absolutely shocked and devastated. Angela had become one of her best friends and now she was dead. She screamed when she was told the news on the phone, and her mother actually ran into the room because she was screaming, but Angela couldn't explain to her what had happened because she was sobbing so much. She was just absolutely heartbroken. I've actually got a quote from Sheila here that says, "I remember screaming and crying. The world was never the same." As a result of Angela's murder, Sheila dropped out of university. She quit her degree. She moved back in with her mum and she rarely went out. She rarely left the house. The world was just such a scary place for her now. So Angela's body was taken for an autopsy which determined that she had been raped and repeatedly stabbed. She was stabbed a total of 18 times and she died as a result of these stab wounds piercing her heart. She also had a few broken bones. It seemed as though she had been badly beaten before she died. It was a very violent death. The scene, as you would expect, was absolutely covered in blood, and so was Angela's body. From the amount of blood there was, it literally looked as though her heart had been cut out of her chest. It was so horrific. A blood sample of the killer was recovered from the scene, as well as the killer's semen, because obviously Angela was raped. And I believe fingernail samples of the killer were also found. However, even though this evidence of the killer had been recovered, at the time in 1984, DNA and forensic technology in criminal cases was in its infancy. It was a very new thing, and it wasn't even nearly as functional and advanced as it is today, and so it didn't really help in this case. It couldn't identify the killer. But on to the investigation into Angela's murder. Now, the police had a few suspects in mind, the first being her boyfriend at the time. Now, I couldn't actually find his name anywhere. I'm guessing it's not public information, but I think he was just a suspect because, well, one, he was her boyfriend, and this kind of stuff does happen in relationships, and so police have to look into it. And two, because he was the last person to see her alive. If you remember, in the early hours of the morning, she went to her boyfriend's apartment to say goodnight to him, and then she went back to her apartment. But he was quickly ruled out as having anything to do with Angela's murder. There was clearly solid evidence to say that he didn't. I believe another suspect in Angela's murder was her ex-boyfriend. Now, if you remember, Angela's best friend Sheila really didn't like him, and that was because he could apparently be really controlling and abusive and violent towards Angela. According to one source online, one night when Angela was still with this boy, he actually shredded her clothes and he pulled a knife on her, which actually resulted in the police being called. So he was horrifically abusive, but he was ruled out as having anything to do with Angela's murder. He wasn't the killer. I believe he had a rock-solid alibi, and his blood type did not match that of the killer's blood. Now, around this time in the early stages of the investigation, the detectives investigating Angela's murder was speaking to her friends, her uni friends, about her life, her time at school, her friends, who she liked, who she didn't like. And Sheila, Angela's roommate and best friend, were one of those people that spoke to the detective. She went down to the police station and she would answer questions about Angela. And while Sheila was speaking to the detectives, they told her that they were looking at a 23-year-old man named Russell Buchanan as the main suspect. Now, if you remember, Angela went to the State Fair and the Rio Room Dance Club the evening before she was murdered with two friends. And one of these friends was Russell Buchanan. Russell and Angela were friends, and they were seen at the bar together in the Rio Room Dance Club. Russell was a couple years older than Angela, and he was an architect. He was described as being quite shy and quiet. I don't think he had too many friends, which is why Angela invited him out with her. But the police believed that although Russell and Angela were good friends, Russell probably wanted something more, and he wanted a romantic relationship with her. But of course, she already had a boyfriend, and so it was theorized that maybe he decided to rape and kill Angela after she refused to be with him in that way. As far as I'm aware, there was literally no concrete evidence linking Russell to the crime. However, I did read on a couple of sources that when Angela's autopsy was done, it concluded that the man who raped her was a non-secretor, which basically means he did not have blood in his secretions, such as his saliva or semen. And Russell Buchanan was a non-secretor, and so they straight away pretty much just pointed the finger at him, even though I believe they had no other evidence linking him to the crime. I'm not entirely sure how common it is to be a non-secretor. I did read on one source that about 20% of people are non-secretors, so about 1 in 5 people. But with this and the fact that he was with Angela on the night that she died, the Dallas police just thought that he seemed like a suspect, the main suspect. But of course, if they've got no evidence, they can't charge him with anything, and so they needed some help to find some. And Angela's best friend Sheila was determined to help. She wanted justice for her friend, and she wanted to aid police in the investigation as much as she could. And so to do this, it was suggested by the police that Sheila start having conversations with the main suspect, Russell, not questioning him, just chatting to him about the night of Angela's murder. Because at this point, Russell had already given his statement to the police about the night of Angela's murder, and so the police wanted to see if he would trip over this story and tell Sheila something different to what he told them so that they could catch him out. But it didn't really work. His story that he told Sheila was the same story that he told the police, but Sheila wasn't giving up. Sheila asked Russell if he wanted to meet up and go out for dinner with her so that they could, you know, chat about it some more, and he agreed. And the police were fully aware of this, of course, this fake dinner, but Russell wasn't. He had no idea that Sheila was working with the police to catch him out. But anyway, one evening, Russell picked Sheila up and they went to a restaurant called August Moon. The police had given Sheila a wire to wear under her clothes so that officers nearby could hear the whole conversation, and so the whole conversation was being recorded. And just like planned, Sheila began asking Russell questions about the night of Angela's murder. She wasn't being too obvious about it because obviously she didn't want him to realise what she was actually doing. But Sheila remembers feeling very nervous and scared that night because she really thought that she was sitting next to Angela's murderer. But anyway, they had dinner, and afterwards Sheila went back to the detectives and told them that his story was pretty much the same. He didn't seem to slip up, and so once again they had nothing. However, they were still convinced that he was Angela's killer, and so they kept bringing him into the police station for questioning, and they even made him do a lie detector test, although I couldn't find whether or not he passed it. Up until this point, Russell Buchanan had been very cooperative with the police. He did all the questionings, he did the lie detector test, he seemed to want to help as much as he could, but eventually he decided to get a lawyer. And as time went on, the detectives still couldn't find any concrete evidence linking him to the murder of Angela Samota, and so he was never charged with it. And by the summer of 1985, this case just went completely cold. Years and years went by, and I don't really know if anyone was still looking into it. It seemed as though this case would just remain unsolved forever. And then 9 years later, in 1994, Angela's old roommate and best friend Sheila was sat in bed and she was watching the trial of O.J. Simpson, which I'm sure I don't have to explain that case to you. It's one of the most famous, if not the most famous, murder case in history, in US history. Just for a brief explanation, O.J. Simpson was on trial for the murder of his ex-wife Nicole and her friend Ron. But anyway, Sheila was sat watching the O.J. Simpson trial, and if you've watched the trial yourself or you've read about this case, you will know that blood and DNA evidence of the killer was found at the crime scene. And by this point in 1994, so 10 years after Angela's murder, there had obviously been a lot of advancements in forensic technology, and in some criminal cases they were able to take DNA and match it to the exact person that it had come from, if that makes sense. Whereas in 1984, when Angela was murdered, DNA and forensic technology was new. It was a new thing, it was in its infancy, and so they couldn't really do this. But anyway, Sheila remembers watching the O.J. Simpson trial and hearing about all this DNA technology and thinking that there was hope in Angela's case. Because obviously, if you remember, the killer's blood, semen and fingernails were found at the scene, and so she thought that maybe after all these years these samples could be retested and they might shed some light on who the killer was. So she contacted an organisation that specialised in cold cases to see if they would look into Angela's case, but apparently they refused. I'm not really sure why. One source said that it was because Sheila didn't work in the police force, and so she wasn't really taken seriously. But still, Angela's best friend Sheila just could not give up. She could not just let her friend's killer get away with what he did. And over the years, she would still meet up with the detective involved with Angela's case just to discuss the details, go over evidence and stuff like that. In fact, Sheila and this detective became such good friends over the years that he actually attended her wedding in 1988. So from here on, I will be talking about Sheila a lot. The case focuses on Sheila from here because you'll come to learn that she was a huge part in this case. But I just thought I would let you know that here. If it sounds like I'm talking about Sheila a lot now, it's because she is a huge part in why this case is solved. But anyway, by the year 2004, Sheila and her partner had moved to Tennessee. They had 2 sons together and she had a happy life, but still the unsolved murder of her friend 20 years earlier haunted her and was constantly on her mind. There wasn't a day that went by that she did not think of Angela. And then one evening, Sheila was sat at home. She was doing some homework for Bible study, so she was reading, and then she looked up and she looked to her right and she saw her old friend Angela. Sheila said that Angela didn't speak. She just stood there and she smiled, and she remembered thinking, am I dreaming? What's going on? Is this really Angie? Sheila said that she doesn't really believe in ghosts. However, she feels as though that was Angela trying to send her a message, and she just suddenly thought to herself, okay, it's time to finally get justice for my friend. I've got another quote from Sheila here that says, "I don't know if it was a dream state or what, but Angie was there on the right side of my bed. She didn't say anything, not a thing. It was just her, and I knew it was time." And so as soon as she saw Angela, she picked up her phone and she rang the Dallas Police Department, which was the police department that was investigating her murder all those years ago. The detective that Sheila knew, the one that she became quite good friends with and that attended her wedding, wasn't actually on shift at the time that she rang, and so she left a message for him saying, "Can you please bring me back?" But he never did. And so she rang again and again, and in the end, Sheila said that she rang around 700 times and she was just completely ignored. Which, as you can imagine, she was pretty annoyed about. This guy, this detective, had become almost like a friend to her, and he was even invited to her wedding, and now he was just completely ignoring her calls about Angela. And it seemed as though the Dallas Police Department just kind of thought, well, you know, this case is really old, the chances of it being solved now are pretty slim, so why waste our time looking into it? And I know that the police are really busy and they have other stuff to look into, but to just completely ignore Sheila, I just think is really wrong and unfair. I think the officers also thought that Sheila would eventually just give up and stop calling, but she didn't. She was not letting this go. Like I said, they would rarely return Sheila's calls, and when they did, they would just say that there was nothing that could be done and this case had gone cold. And they even went so far as to say that Angela's case files had been lost and destroyed in a flood. But this was a lie just to get Sheila off of their backs. Sheila knew that because she wasn't in the police force and criminal justice field, she would never be taken seriously, and so she decided that if no one was going to help her solve this case, then she would just have to do it on her own. And so she made the decision to train and become a private investigator. So she was revising and she was taking her exams, which she passed, and eventually she became one. She became a licensed private investigator. She began printing off all of the reports about Angela's murder, and she would literally study them. And she thought that now that she was a private investigator, she would be taken more seriously. But she wasn't really. Even though she was now a qualified private investigator and she was in the criminal field, she just was dismissed again by the Dallas Police Department, and they even said to her, quote, "Some cases just aren't meant to be solved." But of course, Sheila was not dropping this. She had just trained as a private investigator. She was not letting this go now. However, eventually, Sheila says that the police department were just so fed up with her constant phone calls pushing them to look into Angela's murder that they finally just decided to reopen the case. And honestly, I think that Sheila is such an amazing woman. She never stopped trying to get justice for her friend. She never gave up, and she never let the police give up either. So finally, more than 20 years after Angela's murder, her case was reopened and it was given to a female detective named Linda Crum in 2006. Linda began looking at all the evidence and going through Angela's case files, and obviously by this time in 2006, DNA and forensic technology had come such a long way since 1984, and so they decided to reevaluate the DNA that was found in Angela's apartment, so like the killer's blood and his semen and his fingernails. Then one day, Sheila received a phone call from Linda, the detective that was also looking into this case, and Linda told Sheila that after all these years, they had finally found a match to Angela's killer's DNA. Now, Sheila actually expected Linda to say that it was a match to Russell Buchanan because although there was virtually no evidence linking him to the crime, she and the other police officers still believed that he was Angela's killer. They still believed that he was the main suspect in this case. But it wasn't. The DNA wasn't a match to Russell Buchanan. Linda had used the DNA samples and tested them against people already with a criminal record, and one day in 2008, a match was found. The match was to a man named Donald Bess, and this was a name that Sheila had never heard of before. Donald had never been a suspect in this case. Donald Bess was a 60-year-old man at the time that he was caught in 2008, which I believe made him 36 at the time of Angela's murder. He was born in 1948 in Arkansas, and he was over 6 foot tall, he had white hair, and he weighed about 350 pounds. He would have found it very easy to overpower a young woman such as Angela. At the time that the match was made in 2008, Donald was already in prison in Texas. He was a convicted rapist who was already serving a 25-year sentence for the kidnap and rape of a woman in 1978. However, on the night of Angela's murder, Donald Bess was actually out on parole. So just to briefly explain this, Angela's murder took place in 1984. Before this, he raped another woman, and when he was out on parole for this rape, he killed Angela. And then after this, he went to trial for the rape of that woman, and he was sentenced to 25 years. So he was never caught for Angela's murder up until this point, but that's why he was in prison at the time that he was caught. Does that make sense? But finally, there was enough evidence to charge someone with Angela's murder, and in 2010 the case actually went to trial because despite all the evidence, Donald Bess decided to plead not guilty. During the trial, the prosecution told their version of events, what they believed happened on the night that Angela died. The prosecution said that that night, once Angela had gotten back to her apartment after having gone to the club with Russell and her other friend, she had a knock at the door. It was Donald Bess. It's believed that Donald told Angela that he desperately needed to use the toilet, and so he knocked on her door and asked if he could use hers. And so she said yes, she let Donald in, but she was of course a little bit worried because this was a man that she didn't know, and so she rang her boyfriend. If you remember from earlier on in the video, the call did go through, but all Angela could say was "talk to me" before the phone disconnected. And then as soon as the line went dead, Donald Bess attacked Angela. He raped her and he stabbed her to death with a knife, and then he just left the scene. During his trial, several witnesses came forward to testify that they were also raped by Donald Bess, including his ex-wife, who said that he abused her and her child whilst they were still married. This man was just disgusting. He felt as though he could abuse and rape any women that he wanted to. But in 2010, 26 years after the crime, Donald Bess was found guilty of the murder of Angela Samota. As we know, he was already serving a 25-year sentence at the time for the kidnap and rape of another woman, and so after his conviction, he was actually sentenced to death. Donald is currently on death row. I don't believe he's been given his execution date as of yet. And unbelievably, he has actually tried to appeal his sentence a few times because he felt as though it was too harsh. But of course, all of these appeals have been rejected, and this man will rot in prison for the rest of his life until he is put to death. Angela's best friend Sheila is still a private investigator to this day, which she actually didn't expect to be. After Angela's case was solved, she actually planned on retiring because the whole reason she trained as one in the first place was to get some justice for her friend. However, Sheila started receiving letters and being contacted by other families of murder victims whose cases had gone cold, just begging her for help. And so she decided to continue working as a private investigator to help these families. And like I said, she is still working as one today, and she actually runs her own firm, which is called Without Warning Private Investigation. And that is pretty much it for this case. That is the case of Angela Samota, a really heartbreaking one, but at the same time, it's a really unique case. I've never come across a case quite like this, where a friend of the victim has gone to the lengths of training as a private investigator to get justice. I just think Sheila is such an amazing woman. She never gave up hope. She never stopped in trying to find her friend's killer, and I firmly believe that if it wasn't for her, this case would still be unsolved to this day. And yeah, that is it for this case. Please do let me know your thoughts and opinions on it in the comments. Also let me know your suggestions for other true crime cases that I can cover. Quickly before I go, I just want to give a special shout out to the members of my Patreon page. Thank you so much for your support, guys. If anyone else wants to become a member of our little Patreon family, the link is always in the description of my videos. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. And I will see you again very soon for another mystery with Mollie. Bye guys.